This episode is sponsored by the Expert Services Directory. Are you a coach, consultant, speaker, or trainer who wants to sell your services to corporate clients across the UK, but you're booking fewer than 5 qualified sales calls from your lead generation each month? Or finding that all of your inbound inquiries are coming from junior employees in firms who just want to benchmark your pricing rather than actually introduce you to the real decision maker who has the buying power to get you in? And you really want to generate real qualified inbound inquiries from decision makers in organisations around the UK who actually have buying power and want to purchase your services as an external supplier? Well, that is exactly what the Expert Services Directory is for. And if you visit www.expertservicesdirectory.com and sign up now, you can generate qualified corporate leads for 12 whole months by being part of the Expert Services Directory, where we proactively market specialist providers just like you to real decision makers in companies across the UK who are ready to buy from external suppliers. And if you use the code podcast at checkout, all caps, you'll also get a free corporate priorities calendar that you can use to understand exactly what decision makers are prioritizing at each point in the year so that you can create solutions that sell all year round as well. All you have to do is visit www.expertservicesdirectory.com and enter the code podcast, all in capital letters, at the checkout now. Right, let's get back to the episode. Welcome to the Selling to Corporate podcast, where we're going to be challenging your sales beliefs around selling to corporate organizations and help you increase your bottom line profits every single month. I am Jessica Lorimer, your sales expert and guide in this world of selling to corporate companies, skyrocketing your company sales and making the impact that you really want in the world. Now, don't forget, if you do enjoy the show today, please do head over to iTunes and leave us a review. But enjoy this episode, and I am really looking forward to sharing some epic sales wisdom with you. Welcome, welcome. We are speeding through April, and if you can hear banging in the background, that is Owen building me another beehive. So if you are disturbed during this episode, I know that Scott will do the very best he can with it, but if you do hear banging, it is just our love of bees and specifically not wanting them to swarm anywhere. So making the extra beehives in advance. So I do apologise for any diminished sound quality, as it were, in this episode as a result of my, love of small flying creatures. So it's an exciting time because we obviously have hit the new financial year. And in the last episode, we talked a little bit about some of the, I'm going to say, interesting changes that have been happening across the space. And today's episode is actually a lot more positive in terms of the trends that we're seeing from Q1 and specifically that I'm seeing from the data that I have access to as somebody who works with lots of professional sales teams. Now, you might think, well, how is that relevant to me, Jess, because I'm not in a professional sales team? But the reality is the data that I get to look at whilst working with large professional sales teams is A, high volume data across all of the core areas of the framework that I teach. So across lead generation, across sales calls techniques, across communication, across all of the sales process. So I'm seeing that data, but in enormously high volume. Whereas when you are looking at your sales data, you might be looking at 10 sales calls instead of over 1,000 in a month. Right? So there's a huge difference in the volume that I'm exposed to. And B, because of the way that I'm able to interpret and use that data and then interrogate it and use it on the entrepreneurial side, because it is different being part of a professional sales team where your only job is to sell for 35 to 40 hours a week in comparison to being an entrepreneur where not only do you have to run your own sales process, but you also have to run your own delivery process. You have to do all of your bookkeeping and accounting and the HR department and the marketing department and everything else in between. So I'm exposed to all this data that I can then interrogate and interpret and bring to you as an expert, not only in the sales consulting space, but also as an entrepreneur. That is why this episode's important. And it's why when we talk about sales strategy and creating sales strategy, which I've talked about a lot over this podcast generally, but also specifically over the last few episodes around things like peer accountability groups and the Racing to the Bottom episode that came out a fortnight ago. It's why the information that I'm giving you is important, and it's why setting a sales strategy that is accurate to you is so important. And that is something that there's this really big differentiator at the moment, because what a lot of people are focusing on is marketing activity and not sales strategy. And actually, the trends that we're seeing, especially from Q1 this year, are showing that marketing activity in the B2B space is limited on the entrepreneurial front for a lot of reasons that I'll talk about in both today's episode and in future episodes where they're relevant, because I think it's a much bigger conversation that we need to have. So, before we get into today's episode, I'm going to say that I'm doing a free masterclass. Yay! It's on the 24th of April. It's at 12 noon. You should get yourself signed up because it's called How to Get in Front of Corporate Clients Without Using Cold Outreach or Having a Big Following. And I honestly think, having prepped for it for the last couple of weeks, that it's going to be one of the best masterclasses I've done in, I don't know, maybe 2.5 years. Not because all my other ones are terrible, but because this is based on some very, very recent, very, very relevant data that obviously I've just talked about, and because it is impacting how the market is going to look specifically this year when it comes to getting in front of corporate clients. And I know that there's a lot in the online education space at the moment around people making the shift to selling to corporates and, helping their mates along the way, which is absolutely fine. I have no problem with that at all, as you will know from my episode on peer support and accountability. But like I said earlier, if you're not taking advice and support from people who are able, doesn't even have to be me, who are able to access a high volume of data and interrogate it and interpret that for the entrepreneurial market, then you are potentially using strategies that aren't going to benefit you in the new economic landscape. So I've created this masterclass. It is free. It is 60 minutes long with a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please show up live. And it's called How to Get in Front of Corporate Clients Without Cold Outreach or Having a Big Following. So I will pop the link in the show notes for this episode for you to join that. And that masterclass is also sponsored by the Expert Services Directory, which you may have seen out on LinkedIn over the last couple of weeks. I'm very excited about it. Created a company page, no less. Doing some experiments on that front. So I will let you know in due course how they perform. And again, share a volume of data with you and interrogate it and interpret it in the right way. But seriously, if you haven't signed up to the masterclass because you're not on my email list and therefore haven't heard about it, or you've been hiding under a rock somewhere and trying to ignore the fact that it's happening, please do go and sign up. I use a webinar platform that gives me 100 spaces to the masterclass. On some occasions, we've had up to 700 people register for masterclasses, which I've done, all that I've done, bad grammar, which seems crazy to me. So please do make sure you are registered. If you aren't able to attend live, there will be a replay. The replay will only be for 24 hours. So just covering all my bases and managing expectations like the professional communicator that you would think I am. Okay, so let's talk about some of these trends then, because it is going to be an interesting start to Q2. And if you are not up on the trends, then it's quite possible that it's going to be slower for you to take action and that you're going to miss out some really simple opportunities that actually would have made a huge difference. So let's dig in. Firstly, the Q1 market actually showed that it is a very, very positive time to be an external supplier. Now, this is because companies around the globe, but particularly in the UK, where we've had some, I'm going to say, interesting leadership from government and policy set from government that has made it actually really expensive for firms to hire permanent staff and employees. So actually, we're finding, not just in the UK, but across Central Europe and America, that companies are starting to prefer to scale using interim, freelance, project basis resource. And that is great news for anybody who is an independent coach, consultant, speaker, trainer, done-for-you service provider, expert, whatever you want to call yourself. But that is a really, really positive trend. And it's actually something that I talked about and predicted back last year, if you remember. And that was because I was looking at an insane amount of research on spend, particularly around headcount in organizations, and looking at the data that was coming back from sales calls that professional sales teams were having in organizations that I was working with. So we know that there is this positive trend to hire more external suppliers. And this for me is really interesting because when we think about the way that industries work and the economy works, there's always this exchange of money, right? That's how we operate businesses. You deliver a service, you get paid. Now, what's interesting to me is that if we look at the online education space, for example, the money doesn't ever seem to land. And what I mean by that is that you might go onto a course that you've paid for, and somebody else in that course who's also paid for it might then have a service that you also want. So you pay that person. And then they might decide they want your service, and so they pay you. And then you pay another person on the course, and the cycle goes on and on. And essentially what we see is this like washing machine creation where the money just moves around from person to person to person to person. Now, when we're selling to organizations and when organizations are selling to other organizations, to consumers, the money has a finite point. You deliver to the organization, they pay you. You deliver again to the organization, they pay you. You're not giving that money back necessarily, unless, of course, you're working with retailers and you're like die-hard fan of their products. But I work with a lot of software companies, and believe it or not, I don't want to always buy specific cloud-based solutions to help healthcare providers. Not for myself, right? So what we see when we're selling to companies instead of selling to other entrepreneurs is that there's this value exchange, but also that we're retaining the money rather than the money being passed around to a lot of what becomes really good friends. Okay? So that in itself is positive. More external suppliers being hired, actually more money landing with external suppliers rather than being passed around from person to person. And that means that the economy continues to be stimulated, because if we are, as external suppliers, retaining that cash and not just passing it around a specific group, what then happens is that we are able to go and spend that money on good things that we want to spend it on. So for some people, they have heavy investments in charity. I'm one of those people. I like to donate significant portions of revenue to charity. We have people who are paying off their mortgages, kids' school fees, holidays. To be clear, I don't really care what you spend your money on. It's your money. I think that anything that anyone chooses to spend money on, particularly in a downwards economy, is a good thing because it keeps it moving. But my point here is that that money is able to go on and do something as a result for you specifically, because you have been paid and the money has been retained by you. Okay? So that's positive. And in terms of trends, what we are seeing is because companies are wanting to use external suppliers because of the significantly increased cost of hiring permanent employees, of recruitment fees, but also in terms of the training and onboarding costs and the quite fragile state of the jobs market at the moment, that actually companies are searching for external suppliers more than ever before. So again, positive trend. Instead of going out and saying we're going to put out a job advert for a permanent, leadership coach, for example, or a permanent head of well-being, actually companies are thinking, well, what well-being initiative do we want to allocate resource to in this quarter, in this half year, etc.? And how can we go and find the right person? So this is all positive. And before you sit there and go, oh, well, great, this sounds amazing, Jess, I'm just going to sit back, wait for the leads to roll in. What I am going to say is that as a result of these trends, these positive trends where companies are recognizing more than ever before that hiring experienced external suppliers saves them a massive cost in terms of training, recruitment, onboarding, and are actively looking for external suppliers, there is one small fly in the ointment, and that is the biggest trend change that I've seen this quarter, which is that organizations and specifically decision makers in companies are changing how they're looking for suppliers. Now, this is actually because of something I discussed in the last episode, the Racing to the Bottom episode. And specifically, this is, or what has had a major impact on this, is that there has been this huge influx of unqualified suppliers and also an influx of people who are great marketers but not great at delivery who've entered the market. Because what happened when we started to see this economic downward shift was that a lot of people who weren't previously selling into corporate organizations, and that could be because they were hired as a permanent resource, so they weren't looking to build their own coaching, consulting practices, or because they were focused on selling to consumers, when that revenue started to dip or those jobs started to fall away, those people came into the market. Now, this is not me saying all of those people are terrible and shouldn't be selling to companies, by the way. There is a small percentage who unfortunately cause problems for the rest of us, who have entered the market, who don't have the right skills, ability, or commitment to be selling to and delivering transformation to corporate clients. That has always been the case. That has not changed. It's just that we've seen an influx because obviously the market in other areas has changed. So we're seeing more of those people coming across to sell to corporates. And unfortunately, some of them are great marketers. They've got huge followings. They, are people who are very well known. However, you probably like me have seen various iterations of this happening. In fact, a few years ago on the podcast, I talked about, there was an episode I did and I can't remember the title now, but we'll put it in the show notes for you, about celebrities moving into the corporate space. And, there were lots of celebrities who, particularly just after COVID, looked at the money that they could be making as speakers or trainers or consultants in the corporate space. And the most famous one that I think I referenced in that episode was Joe Wicks. Joe Wicks, who was well known for being like the UK's PE teacher during lockdown, after COVID, went and started working with organisations as a speaker, looking at wellbeing initiatives, like making lots of money. But it was interesting because he was somebody who had this huge following. And I don't disagree. Like, for the record, I have no real feelings on Joe Wicks. I didn't actually watch any of his videos during lockdown. He seems like a chirpy guy. Fine. But I knew lots of other wellbeing consultants, speakers, coaches who at that time had PhD qualifications, master's qualifications, had worked extensively on research on workplace wellbeing, had put wellbeing initiatives in place for companies for years and years and years. And they were being passed over because there was somebody who was more famous. Now that is interesting in the current market, because in the current market, there are going to be loads of people who previously, and I would call the influencer crowd some of this, who've previously made money from selling through their content creation to consumers on like TikTok Shop or Instagram or whatever. That is now being squeezed because obviously consumers have lower amounts of disposable income. So soon we're going to see this influx, like I've predicted for months and months, of these people moving across into the B2B space. Now, some of that isn't going to impact you at all as a coach or a consultant, speaker or trainer, right? Some of that won't impact you because it will be that they're doing brand partnerships. They're signing bigger sponsorship deals. Those sorts of things that you are not interested in. But there are also going to be instances where people who are not as qualified as you, but who are great marketers, have big followings, are going to be going and pitching for corporate work because at the moment, that's where the cash is. And I don't want you to be caught out by that. So we have to recognize that the biggest shift in Q1 has absolutely been that there is this influx of unqualified suppliers coming into the market and what that could potentially do for your pipeline and your business, but also the way in which it means that companies have changed their approach to searching for suppliers because they know that they need external suppliers, they need experts, they need people who are able to come in, take action, help them get the transformation they've paid for, and then let them implement and maintain, right? So, what does this actually mean in a practical perspective? Now, I'm going to say again, if you haven't signed up to the masterclass yet, the link is in the show notes. It's specifically called How to Get in Front of Corporate Clients Without Cold Outreach or a Big Following, for the reason that I just mentioned. It's almost like I thought about it. But please go and get yourself signed up to it because it is going to be a really valuable session. We're going to be digging into some more of these trends, specifically around lead generation and how companies are going to be searching for suppliers over the next 6 to 12 months. So it's really, really important that if you are somebody who recognizes that you don't have enough leads turning into sales calls or enough leads full stop from corporate clients right now, that you go and get yourself registered. Okay. Now, this brings me on to some of the changes. Now, I'm talking to my clients about these a lot. In fact, we've got an in-person day for our C-suite cohort at the end of April on the 27th. Very excited. Get to do a masterclass and then an in-person day, all in the space of 7 days. I'm buzzing. Laughing to myself because I've said buzzing and obviously all I can hear is a beehive being made in the background. But I'll be talking a lot about that to our C-suite cohort on the 27th of April as well. So this is something that we're internally in my company, we're looking at and making changes and giving advice and guidance on a lot. And so one of the big things that comes about as part of this particular trend, so this particular trend around companies needing more external suppliers, but also changing the way that they're searching, is that recommendations and referrals are still the first point of call for a lot of decision makers. So when they're thinking, oh, right, okay, well, we need to get an executive coach in for this person, or we need somebody who can help us deal with conflict communication in this team, or whatever it is that they're looking for, they are going out and asking for recommendations and referrals as their first point of call. Now, this is great for those of us who are actively using key sales strategies and key follow-up strategies and key business development techniques to stay top of mind with organizations and build good, mutually beneficial working relationships with them. So that's great for us because usually we can guarantee ourselves a referral or a recommendation through using those key business development techniques inside organizations and also as decision makers leave organizations and move elsewhere. However, it also isn't that easy because you can't guarantee that the referrals or recommendations will come when you actually want them. So they might come when you're busy with delivery already and you don't have time to take on more. Not only that, but if you're not somebody who's actively using a business development strategy that is built around these specific ways to leverage your relationships even the ones that have never replied to you consistently, then guess what? You're not going to be referred or recommended. And if you're brand new into the market, so if you've been trying to sell to corporates for less than 12 months, you're not already known. So how are you supposed to get and benefit from recommendations and referrals that stakeholders are looking for when you're not even on their radar and nobody at the organisation knows you? So it's hard because in some ways it means that people with established relationships will see more referrals, more recommendations coming through. But it also poses problems in, like I say, the planning and logistics of actually being able to take on that work. The fact that those leads usually aren't qualified because the decision maker hasn't always thought through yet exactly what they need, so they can take a lot longer to convert. And of course, the problem it creates for people who are newer to market in that you're just not known. So how are you supposed to get those recommendations and referrals? Nobody's going to 30 networking events every single month in the hope that one of the companies at that specific time might have a need and you can get that recommendation referral. Yeah. I actually talked to an HR director recently for a company that I've done a lot of work with over the last 4 years. And it was really interesting because she was saying that she had a need specifically for a type of leadership expert. She was looking for somebody who was very, very experienced when it came to conflict. And she said, I've got budget. I can sign off up to, I think it was about 15K. She was like, I've got this budget. I've got this ability to sign off up to this certain level. She was like, but I cannot find anyone. She's like, I've asked around for recommendations. I have asked people in the company who they've worked with previously. I sent an email out to people in the senior leadership team asking if they'd ever worked with anybody like on a self-funded basis. And she's like, and all the recommendations that I kept getting were people who either were no longer in business because it'd been a while ago that they'd been used by those referral sources, or people that weren't able to have discussions with her right now because they were booked or, absent. I was going to say absent. Everyone like holiday and stuff. So she said it became really, really difficult. So she assigned a member of her team, a junior member of staff, to go and scour Google because that's what we'll do, right? And look for a specialist around leadership conflict. And she said it was really frustrating because that person came back and said, here are these 5 different experts. Let me know which ones you want me to set up calls with you for. And she was like, none of them were relevant to what I wanted. She was like, good at SEO for sure, but not actually providing the services that I wanted. Now, obviously, in that case, it's great because I was able to refer her to the expert services directory and say, why don't you go and have a look at these specific people, which made her life really easy. But again, that's her getting a recommendation, a referral, right? So how can you start to be seen? How can you start to make sure that you're cultivating those relationships? And this is not about creating more content. I'm so sick of it that I can't even be beige or by beige, I mean democratic about content creation anymore, because I'm seeing people try and compensate for this change in creating more content. They're creating more LinkedIn posts, they're creating more newsletters, they're creating more freebies, they're doing more webinars, they're doing all of these things, creating more ads, spending more money on ads. And for the B2B market, it just doesn't work. There is no decision maker on this earth who's got 60 minutes to spend looking at a recorded webinar and then go and book a call and then go and have the conversation and then go and get signed, as well as the 7 days of emails that someone's going to send them afterwards to try and sell them something or book the call or whatever the call to action is. It's just not working. So we have to start thinking outside the box, and this does mean that lead generation is more important than ever. It means that if you want to succeed in Q2 and into Q3 and Q4, by having consistent sales calls, by being able to sign consistent deals, that you need to have a focus on lead generation strategies that are working now. Because if you don't, and you continue to do what you've always done that hasn't provided the results that you wanted, and by results that you wanted, you should be aiming for at least 5 qualified sales calls per month, then you need to make a shift. It also doesn't mean looking at quick win things. That's the second real trend that we've looked at this quarter or seen from Q1. I've talked to a lot of decision makers who have been genuinely surprised by the amount of people who are trying to sell AI agents to them who are not AI specialists. And that's been a really interesting conversation. Now, I actually know somebody, I've got a client who is incredible at building out AI agents specifically for organizations. And it's a huge and very, very specialized skill set. But I've been talking to a lot of organizations who've been saying that we're getting invited to have these AI agents, or I don't really know what they're called, but I'm going to use agents for now. But they're built by people who are not AI specialists. And, we being invited to use them for some really confidential and critical work around coaching, around consulting, and they're very cheap. And that's interesting because organizations, when they're talking to me about this, they're not saying, isn't it great we can get access to this cheap AI resource that is going to change XYZ ways of working for us? They're saying, we are concerned that we don't know that this person who is trying to sell us this thing that admittedly is very cost effective is actually qualified to have built it and to have made sure that our data will be safe. So that's important. That's not a conversation that I'm having just about AI, because I know that sometimes it can seem like I hate AI. I really don't. I think it's, as I've always said, very useful for automations and processes and things like that. What that trend does show us, though, is that, or what that conversation shows us about a wider trend, is that organizations know what a quick win or a quick cash grab looks like. And they're also understanding that they are seeing this influx of suppliers who aren't providing the services that they think they're able to deliver in the market. So they're being much more conservative about their investments. Now, this isn't a bad thing, because if you are somebody who is able to provide the service that you are selling and deliver to a high quality standard, you shouldn't be worried about this at all. This isn't something that should concern you. In fact, it's something that will make it a really, really lucrative market for you, because you will not only be hired by organizations who in the first instance want that approach to quality, but also you'll be hired by organizations to fix the problems that others have created. Okay? So it can be a very lucrative thing. It's also incredibly frustrating. And I say that as somebody who goes in to fix quite a lot of problems. It can be incredibly frustrating for that work. And that can actually take a lot more time, headspace, and energy on your part to fix those problems than it would have done to do the initial piece of work. But that relies on your sales process. So what I would say is that with this trend around, should we create something that is cheap and seems like a no-brainer, rather than focusing in on our skills and our areas of genuine expertise and selling those at premium prices? The answer is no. Focus on your skills. Focus on your expertise. Don't do the race to the bottom piece, because it is not working in the way that people expect. It might be completely different in the consumer market. And honestly, I don't know, and I don't look at it, and I don't care, because that's not my focus. My focus certainly is, what are companies looking at? What are they averse to? What are they interested in? What are they taking action on? And that is very, very much about skills, specialist areas of expertise, sales processes that demonstrate quality and credibility the whole way through. As ever, it's been a joy recording this episode. I hope that the bees and the banging haven't been too detrimental to it and that you've managed to get enough information that you need. Like I say, if you do want to pop yourself onto the free masterclass on how to get in front of corporate clients without cold outreach or having a big following, make sure that you go and sign yourself up to the link in the show notes. Very exciting. And that will also automatically subscribe you to our twice weekly newsletter as well. It's quite easy to unsubscribe from that. Once you get a newsletter, if you don't like it, you can just hit the unsubscribe button at the bottom. But I'm just letting you know that is what will happen in advance. Okay, have a lovely couple of weeks. For those of you who are joining me on the masterclass on April 24th, I will see you there. And as always, please do feel free to bring your questions to the masterclass because it's a nice opportunity for me, to be honest, to actually answer some things live. I'll see you in the next episode.